Hello, dear diary. Today is Saturday, September 18th, and this week in Shallow Typed Racket, I was working on some of the contract forms in the language. So things like cast, with type, and right here, define predicate. Now these have different behavior in the Shallow Typed Racket versus normal typed racket. So my plan was to fork them, and now there's two copies of define predicate sitting in the code base. You get one of them when you use the deep language, and another one when you use the shallow language, like we have here. And I ran into an interesting bug. So we're currently at a state where the bug exists. So let me compile the file, and we'll see the error that I saw a couple of days ago, or whenever it is that this tragedy struck. Okay, compile define predicate. Error, line 3, type check, type name used out of context. Type real. Okay, so for some reason it's not happy with this one line that we have in the program. What should normally happen is define predicate takes a name and a type, and at compile time it turns the type into a contract and then binds that contract to the name that you gave it. And that's not what's happening here. What we're getting is similar to the error that you get if type just shows up inside of a program. So if I just write real, which is using a type which is supposed to appear at compile time, just down in your normal runtime code. If we compile that, it's definitely going to complain at the real down on line 5. Yep. Line 5, type name used out of context. So that's bad, and that's basically the same error that we saw before. So I thought to myself, how did I mess up define predicate? What's going on here? So let's go back to the source. Type bracket, base end, prims contract to RKT. This file provides a bunch of things, including 3 copies of define predicate here. One for the normal deep typed racket, and second one here is for shallow. And let's jump to the definition. Okay. So define predicate is a macro that takes in a name and a type, like we'd expect, and then it generates a bunch of code. And the important thing is to look at this type. Where does type go? And it gets sent in as an argument to this make-predicate transient. That looks pretty good. That looks like it should. There's another form in the language called make-predicate, and we can use it like this on the left. Define aha as a make-predicate. Yeah, so make-predicate is an expression form. Takes in a type, gives us a contract at compile time, and then you can use that just like any other runtime value afterwards, including giving it a name. Let's compile this. And that should go just fine. Yes, no problem. So make predicate seems to work at compile time like it should. But define predicate is bad. Even though it looks pretty good as code, and we didn't get an unbound identifier error. So like if this make predicate transient was something else, something totally different or unbound, then we would get a different compile time error. Yeah, this is much more helpful. So we're compiling the file, and then inside of that macro in prims contract at RKT, we see an unbound identifier. So if I had an error like that, I would have known exactly where the problem was. But that's not what happened. I had this good looking code and then that strange error on the left. And come to find out, in between defining the different languages and the dance that this file does up at the top, somehow make-predicate transient was bound as a runtime function or identifier, but not as a phase one or whatever macro phase we're in transformer. So when expanding, we got to the template here, and we start outputting code, define name, let pred, and then this make-predicate transient gets treated just like a function call. And then the argument started to expand, and that's when we got the error, type name used out of context. So my bindings were off. For some reason, this was not the macro that I expected it to be. So let's cut to the chase. The fix was to add a new require for template. Right, inside the macro template for define predicate transient, we need to make sure that the forms we care about are accessible. So forms shallow here. While we're optional, while we're at it, let's get the third one back. Forms optional. Now things should all work out. Yeah. From shallow. Oh yeah. My little trick here for demonstration is getting in the way. Got to delete that. This is the line that I used to reconstruct the bug because I forget exactly how I got myself in that mess. Very good. Okay, so these forms submodules are defined up at the top, and they do a little dance. So this is a submodule inside our prims contract file, which is requiring the outer module, prims contract, lazily. And so this imports things like define predicate transient, and then redefines it with a nicer name, define predicate. I think. Actually. Anyway, the point of these, the lazy require is good because if you have a typed module and it doesn't meet these contract forms, you can save a bit of time and code if you don't have to pull them in. So somehow between these forms and the definition of the language, which I'll just pop over to that, type bracket, typed shallow, no, typed bracket, shallow base. This little file that exports the things that make the front end the shallow type bracket. Pretty small file. So somehow between those two, I was getting the make predicate as a runtime identifier and not as compile time. And the saving grace was, I guess, I knew the expansion steps so that if identifier is not found as a macro, then it'll turn into a function call. And as long as that function is bound, and the arguments will get expanded. And that's that. Maybe someday we can have a way of asserting, I want make predicate transient to be bound to a macro here at the template phase. But until then, we got to take care and make sure things are bound at the right phase for you. Anyway, okay. That's the bug. I guess I'll close this one out with the words of Red Green. If the women don't find you handsome, they should at least find you handy. Take care, dear diary.